January 1942, somewhere southwest of Moscow. The engine had been dead for 6 hours. Oberleutnant Anton Reske stood beside it anyway, one gloved hand resting on the cold steel, because it felt better than standing there with nothing to hold on to. In front of him, snow, and more snow, folding into a white horizon that had already swallowed the road they'd driven in on, the fence line from the map, even the sound of the war itself. 6 months ago, he had crossed this border certain it would be the fastest campaign of his life. His general had said so. Berlin had said so. Home by Christmas, that was the promise. Now half his crew couldn't feel their hands. His fuel had frozen solid in the tank. And somewhere past that white horizon, Soviet divisions built for exactly this cold were forming up to come, for whatever was left of his division. Anton didn't know it yet, standing in that field. But the war was already lost. Not because of the enemy in front of him. Because of 5 decisions, made by men who had never once stood in snow like this. This is his story, and theirs. 5 fatal mistakes. 1 war machine that was supposed to be unstoppable. Here's how it broke. Starting 6 months earlier, at a border Anton Reske was sure he'd only have to cross once. The morning of June 22, 1941, began with a sound Anton Reske never found words for. Not thunder, not engines, but something underneath both. A low hum rising through the ground before it reached the ear. 3.5 million men were crossing the border at once. Reske's company was only a single thread in that fabric, but at 26 he wasn't thinking about the fabric. He was thinking about the compass bearing chalked onto his tank's hull and about his commander, a broad, sunburned man named Oberst Wallen, who had stood on his own turret the night before and promised, without a flicker of doubt, that they'd winter in Moscow, that this would be finished long before the first snow touched the steppe. Reske believed him. Everyone did. Belief came easy in June, with the grain fields gold on either side of the column, and the whole of the east seemingly open in front of them. That night, by lantern light, he wrote to his mother. Told her not to worry. Told her the war would likely be over before her letter even reached her, and signed it the way he always did. He had no way of knowing it would be the last letter home he'd write, feeling certain he'd live to write another. By October, the spires of Moscow were close enough to see without field glasses, thin gray shapes rising out of the morning haze, close enough to feel like a finish line instead of a target. Reske's company had dug in along a ridge past the city's outer defenses, waiting on orders that finally felt like formality rather than fear. Lieutenant Brandt climbed onto the hull of Reske's tank one evening, boots crunching frost that hadn't yet hardened into real snow, and pointed at the skyline like something he'd already bought. 60 kilometers, he said. 60 kilometers, and then what? A parade through Red Square, and home in time for Christmas dinner. The men laughed the easy laugh of soldiers who've convinced themselves the hardest part is behind them. Reske laughed too, because it was easier than saying what he actually felt, which was smaller and harder to name. Not doubt exactly, just an unwillingness to say the word finished, out loud, as if saying it might undo it. That night he checked the tank's engine twice for no reason he could name, and stood a moment longer than he needed to, watching his breath fog against a sky that had gone, without anyone noticing, from blue to the flat gray of coming weather. The cold came first, then everything else stopped working. Engines that had run flawlessly since June seized overnight, oil turned to sludge, gunbolts froze shut in men's hands. By late November, Reske's company had stopped counting kilometers and started counting fingers. 2 of his crew lost theirs to frostbite inside a week, black at the tips, before anyone could get them near a fire. Then, on December 5th, the silence broke. Not artillery first. Voices. Thousands of them, coming out of the dark in white coats no one had seen before, moving like men who'd trained for exactly this weather their whole lives. Siberian divisions. Fresh, fed, warm. Reske had never been taught to retreat. Nobody had. The doctrine was advance. Always advance, and now he was screaming orders he'd invented on the spot. Pull back, abandon the sledges, leave the dead where they fell, while men who trusted him looked back like he'd betrayed something sacred. He got 11 of 14 out that night. He would spend the rest of his life certain the other 3 were his fault, and not once, not that night, not years later, would it occur to him that the fault had been decided months earlier, in a headquarters far from any snow. The news reached them secondhand, the way important things usually did. Not from an officer, but from a corporal who'd overheard it on a field radio and repeated it wrong twice before someone corrected him. Hitler had declared war on the United States. 4 days after Moscow, 4 days after the retreat, none of them had a name for yet, and already there was a new front nobody had asked for. Reske's radio operator, a quiet 19-year-old named Falk, who kept a photograph of his mother's bakery in Hamburg, folded inside his cap, was the one who finally said what the others were only thinking. He didn't ask about strategy or fronts or numbers. He asked, almost apologetically, as if it were rude to bring up, "Does that mean they'll bomb Hamburg now? Properly, not like before?" Reske opened his mouth to say something reassuring, the kind of thing officers were supposed to say, and found nothing there. He knew exactly as much as Falk did, which was nothing, and pretending otherwise felt like a smaller, meaner version of the same lie that had gotten them into this snow in the first place. So he said the only honest thing available to him. "I don't know." Falk nodded, folded the photograph smaller, and put it away. Weeks became the unit of measurement now, not days. Reske wrote to his mother every 10 days, like clockwork, and for the first time since the war began, nothing came back. No letter, no word. Just silence, stretching out longer than any silence he'd trusted before. He told himself it was the mail. Everyone told each other it was the mail. Routes disrupted, sensors backed up, coordinates changed. Nobody said the other thing out loud. The thing that hung over every conversation, now that the skies over Germany had started filling up with engines that weren't theirs. Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin. Bombers coming through not in raids anymore but in shifts. Day crews handing off to night crews, as if flattening cities had become simply another kind of factory work. Alongside the silence came a number, passed soldier to soldier, like a rumor too strange to be official. America was building more aircraft in a single year than Germany had built in the entire war. 90,000. 100,000. The figure changed depending on who told it, but the shape of it never did. Too large, too fast, too far past anything German industry could match. Reske didn't know which to be more afraid of, the number or the silence where his mother's letters used to be. Oberst Lehmann had argued for withdrawal only once. At a briefing Reske wasn't meant to overhear, a calm, professional case for pulling the line back 40 kilometers before it broke on its own. He wasn't shouted down. Nobody raised their voice. That, more than anything, was what should have worried them. 2 mornings later, his command tent was empty. Not packed up, not left in disorder. Simply empty. Swept. As if no one had ever slept there. No farewell. No transfer notice posted for the men to read. When Reske asked a staff clerk where the Oberst had gone, the man only shrugged and said, "Reassigned," in the flat tone reserved for questions people had learned not to ask twice. His replacement arrived by midday. Younger, precise, a man named Kessler, who inspected boots before he asked anyone's name. Kessler's first order was to hold a position Lehmann would have abandoned without hesitation. His second order was to report, by name, anyone who questioned the first. Reske obeyed both, the way he'd obeyed everything since June, and told himself the difference between Lehmann and Kessler was one of style, not substance, that good officers and cautious ones both wanted the same thing in the end. He would not let himself finish the thought that followed that. The requisition forms went out every month, the same as always: winter boots, tread pins, a new radiator to replace the one patched 3 times already. Every month, a reply promised delivery within the quarter, a phrase that, by 1943, had stopped meaning anything. What arrived instead was ingenuity. Reske's tank ran that year less on fuel than on scavenged parts. A gearbox stripped from a burned-out Panzer II outside Kharkov. Bolts pulled from a wreck nobody would ever drive again. Wiring spliced so often it looked, in low light, like a repaired artery. His driver, a mechanic before the war, had gotten so good at keeping dead machines alive that Reske wondered if he was prouder of the repairs than frightened of what they were repairing him for. Then came the letter. Not official, just a cousin's gossip passed hand to hand, that the factories back in Germany were still running single shifts, still closing on Sundays, as if the war were something happening to other people in another country. Reske read it twice, then folded it into the same pocket where he kept letters he couldn't answer and numbers he didn't believe. His tank was older than the war it was fighting in, held together by other men's wrecks and Berlin's patience for peace. By the summer of 1944, Reske had stopped learning the names of new arrivals. There was no point. A boy would show up wearing a uniform still stiff from the depot, learn which lever stuck on the turret hatch, and be gone within 3 weeks. transferred, wounded, or worse, before Reske had reason to remember his face. His company moved constantly now, sent wherever the map turned red fastest. A ridge outside Warsaw for 11 days, then a river crossing he never learned the name of, then back east again before the mud had dried on his boots. News reached him in fragments, always second-hand, always already old. Someone said the Allies had landed in France. Normandy, someone else corrected, as if the precise beach mattered to men 800 kilometers away. Someone else said an entire army group had simply ceased to exist in the east, erased in a single Soviet offensive whose name none of them could pronounce. Reske stopped trying to hold the whole war in his head. It was too large and moving too fast, and none of it explained why his own war kept shrinking instead. By December, he counted his company the way he now counted everything, quickly and without hope of a better number. 11 men. The order came on the 17th of December, hold the crossroads at all costs, reinforcements to follow. Reske read it twice, looking for words that would make it survivable, and didn't find any. There were no reinforcements coming, there hadn't been in months. 11 men and a crossroads nobody outside this forest had heard of. That was the entire strategic value of what he was being asked to trade them for. For the first time since June of 1941, Anton Reske did not obey. He gathered what was left of his crew in the dark, told them the plan in 4 sentences, and led them west instead of holding east, not toward glory, not toward home, but toward the sound of American engines he'd once been terrified of and now walked toward on purpose. They were taken 2 days later, cold and starving, hands raised, and no one shot them for it. In the camp, weeks passed before the news came the way all news had always come to him. Second-hand, late, and true. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered. And Anton Reske, sitting in a borrowed coat behind Allied wire, finally understood exactly which 5 decisions had cost him everything. 6 months too late to save the men he hadn't been able to.